It was supposed to be a celebration of love, our 5th wedding anniversary. I had spent the entire week organizing a small but meaningful dinner at home, inviting only close family. Our apartment in Boston wasn't large, but I'd transformed our modest dining area into something special for the occasion. Everything looked perfect. The soft candlelight, the polished silverware from our wedding set, the scent of roasted rosemary chicken floating through the house. David, my husband, had offered to help, but I insisted on doing it myself. This dinner wasn't just about celebrating our marriage. It was my chance to finally win over Eleanor, my mother-in-law. After 5 years of sideways glances and backhanded compliments, I thought perhaps a perfect evening might soften her stance toward me. "Emma, the table looks beautiful," David said, coming up behind me and wrapping his arms around my waist. "Mom and Dad should be here any minute." I nodded, checking the timer on the oven again. "And your sister?" Sarah texted. "She's running a bit late, but should be here soon." Beneath the surface, a tension I had tried to ignore buzzed like a warning signal. I'd been on edge all day, which David had chalked up to normal hosting anxiety. He didn't understand the real source of my stress, his mother's imminent arrival. The doorbell rang at exactly 7 p.m. Eleanor was nothing if not punctual. "Let me get that," David said, squeezing my shoulder reassuringly before heading to the door. I checked my appearance. Quickly in the hallway mirror, hair still neatly tucked into a low bun, simple black dress smooth and unwrinkled. I took a deep breath and plastered on my most welcoming smile. Eleanor had arrived last, her arms full of flowers, and her face split into a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Behind her stood Robert, my father-in-law, a quiet man who had always been kind to me, if somewhat distant. "Emma, darling," Eleanor exclaimed, air-kissing both my cheeks. "These are for you. Lilies. They're your favorite, aren't they?" They weren't. I'd mentioned several times that I was allergic to lilies, but I took the bouquet anyway. "Thank you, Eleanor. They're lovely." She always masked her disdain behind courteous gestures. I had long accepted that she never believed I was good enough for her son. In her eyes, I was a distraction from his true potential. The prestigious law career she'd mapped out for him since birth, not the nonprofit work he'd chosen after we met in college. "Let me put these in water," I said, retreating to the kitchen. Could hear David showing his parents to the living room, offering drinks. I placed the lilies far away on a kitchen counter, found a vase, and tried to steady my breathing. This was nothing new, just the usual passive-aggressive dance Eleanor and I had perfected over the years. When I returned, Sarah had arrived, bringing a welcome buffer to the tension. Her easy laugh and genuine warmth always helped smooth family gatherings. After a round of appetizers and small talk, I announced dinner was ready. Tonight, Eleanor's manner felt different. Too sweet, too present. She complimented my cooking. Effusively, asked about my work at the publishing house with seeming interest, and kept touching my arm when she spoke to me. It was unsettling, like watching a tiger suddenly behave like a house cat. "This wine is exquisite," she said as we settled at the dining table. "Let me pour for everyone." She insisted on pouring the wine herself, hovering over my glass with careful precision. It struck me as odd. Eleanor had never served others before. She usually expected to be served. Her eyes didn't leave mine as she handed me the filled flute. And in that moment, I noticed something. Her fingers trembled slightly, and her smile twitched with something unspoken. There was an expectation in her gaze, an anticipation that made my skin crawl. I felt a sudden chill travel down my spine. My instincts screamed at me. I recalled the many accidental slights over the years, the shellfish served at Christmas despite my allergy, the time she forgot to include me in family photos, the stories she told that subtly undermined me. Without Drawing attention, I turned toward the kitchen under the pretense of checking on the food and quietly switched our glasses. When I returned, I handed her the one she had poured for me, now pretending it had always been hers. "A toast," Robert proposed. "To David and Emma. 5 years and many more to come." Everyone raised their glasses. Eleanor raised hers to her, lips with an air of triumph. I raised mine too, but barely took a sip, pretending to drink while watching her over the rim of my glass. She took a generous swallow, her eyes never leaving mine. Conversation flowed as we moved through the courses. David told a funny story about a client. Sarah showed pictures from her recent trip to Colorado, and Robert asked about my parents in Vermont. It was almost normal, almost pleasant. But I couldn't shake the feeling of wrongness, especially as I noticed Eleanor becoming increasingly animated, her laugh a little too loud, her gestures a bit too expansive. That was when the night began to unravel. As I stood to clear the plates before dessert, I caught Eleanor's gaze again. For just a moment, confusion flickered across her face. She blinked rapidly, as if trying to clear her vision. A chill ran through me, as I realized my suspicions might be correct. Glanced at the wine bottle, wondering what exactly she had done. The evening stretched before me like a tightrope, and I knew we were all about to fall. We were halfway through dinner when I noticed the change in her. Eleanor had become unusually talkative during the main course, laughing too loudly at David's jokes and interrupting Sarah's stories. At first, everyone seemed charmed by this uncharacteristic warmth. But as I brought out the chocolate mousse I'd prepared for dessert, her demeanor shifted dramatically. Her posture slumped slightly, and her speech slowed. The sentence she'd been forming about her garden club trailed off into silence. Robert glanced at her with concern. "Are you feeling all right, dear?" he asked, placing a hand on her arm. "I'm just a bit warm," she said, tugging at the collar of her expensive blue blouse. "Is it hot in here, David?" My husband shook his head. "The temperature's fine, Mom. Maybe you've had a bit too much wine?" He chuckled, trying to keep things light. But then, her complexion changed, going ashen, and her breathing turned erratic. She tried to stand, swayed dangerously, and gripped the edge of the table. "I need some air," she mumbled, but her legs buckled beneath her. Forks clattered onto plates as the room turned silent, then panicked. David jumped up and caught his mother before she could hit the floor. He eased her into her chair while Sarah rushed to open a window. Mom, what's wrong?" David's voice rose with alarm. She clutched the edge of the table with white knuckles, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. Robert rushed to her side while I stood frozen. A part of me wanted to leap forward, to help, to pretend none of this had anything to do with me. But another part, deeper, colder, watched in a kind of suspended shock, knowing exactly what was happening, and why. The wine. She hadn't expected to drink it. "Call an ambulance," Robert shouted, his usual calm shattered. Sarah was already on her phone, speaking rapidly to the 911 operator. I forced myself to move, to act as the concerned daughter-in-law. I fetched a cold washcloth from the bathroom and brought it to David, who pressed it against his mother's forehead. "What's happening to her?" he asked, his voice strained with fear. I shook my head, pretending confusion. Eleanor's eyes rolled slightly, struggling to focus. "Something's wrong," she slurred. "I can't. Everything's spinning." Sarah knelt beside her, holding her hand. "The ambulance is on its way, Eleanor. Just try to stay calm." I moved into action mode, clearing space in the entryway for the paramedics, gathering Eleanor's purse and phone, finding her medication list in her wallet. All the while, my mind raced. What had she put in my wine? How dangerous was it? Would they test for substances at the hospital? Within minutes, The sound of sirens filled our quiet Cambridge neighborhood. 2 paramedics entered with efficient movements, asking questions about Eleanor's medical history and what she'd consumed. Robert answered most of their questions, while David hovered anxiously nearby. "Has she taken any medications today?" one paramedic asked. "Just her blood pressure pills this morning," Robert replied, "and some wine with dinner." The paramedic nodded, checking Eleanor's vitals. "Her blood pressure is low, and her pupils are dilated. Has she ever had a reaction to alcohol before?" "Never," Robert said firmly. "She has a glass or 2 most evenings." I stood back, watching as they transferred Eleanor to a stretcher. Her skin had taken on a waxy appearance, and her breathing seemed labored. For a moment, fear gripped me. What if whatever she'd put in the wine was more dangerous than I'd thought? What if this was serious? "I'll go in the ambulance," Robert said. "David, you follow with the car." My husband nodded, grabbing his keys. "Emma, you coming?" I hesitated only briefly. "Of course." As they wheeled Eleanor out, her eyes suddenly locked on mine, not with gratitude or fear, but with dawning realization. In that moment of clarity, I saw her understand what had happened. She knew I had switched our glasses. For the first time, she was truly vulnerable in front of me. For the first time, I held the upper hand. The ride to Mount Auburn Hospital was tense and silent. David drove with white-knuckled concentration, while Sarah sat in the back seat, occasionally updating us on texts from her father. I stared out the window at the familiar streets, now transformed by flashing emergency lights. The guilt I expected to feel was strangely absent. Instead, I felt numb, almost detached, as if watching events unfold from a distance. "I don't understand what happened," David said, breaking the silence as we turned onto the hospital approach. "She was fine 1 minute, and then... Maybe it was some kind of interaction with her medication," I suggested, the lie feeling bitter on my tongue. "Maybe," he muttered, but I could hear the worry in his voice. The emergency room was busy for a Thursday night. We found Robert in the waiting area, his face drawn with concern. "They've taken her back for tests," he explained. "They think it might be some kind of reaction, but they're not sure to what." We settled in to wait, the bright fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell creating a surreal backdrop to the evening that had started so differently. David paced, while Sarah scrolled through her phone, researching possible causes for Eleanor's symptoms. I sat quietly, my mind racing with scenarios and consequences. An hour passed before a doctor emerged, asking for the family of Eleanor Harrington. We stood as one. "Mrs. Harrington is stable," the doctor said, and I felt David's body relax beside me. "But we've found something concerning in her blood work." "What is it?" Robert asked, his voice tight. "Traces of a benzodiazepine, a mild sedative," the doctor explained. "It's not at dangerous levels, but it's definitely in her system. Is she prescribed any medications like Valium or Xanax?" Robert shook his head firmly. "Absolutely not. Just her blood pressure medication." The doctor's expression grew more serious. "Well, the combination of the sedative with alcohol is what caused her symptoms. We're going to keep her overnight for observation, but she should be fine by morning. The effects will wear off naturally." David ran a hand through his hair, confusion evident on his face. But how would that get in her system? Could there be a mix-up with her regular medication? "It's possible," the doctor said cautiously. "Or she could have taken something without realizing what it was. We see that sometimes with older patients who confuse their pills. But Eleanor wasn't that type of older patient. She was meticulous, organized, and sharp as a tack. Everyone in the room knew that." "Can we see her?" Sarah asked. The doctor nodded. She's drowsy but awake. 2 at a time, please." Robert and David went first, while Sarah and I remained in the waiting room. Neither of us spoke. When they returned, Sarah and her father went for coffee, leaving David and me alone. "I don't get it," David said, sinking into the chair beside me, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. "Mom doesn't take anything she's not prescribed. She barely even takes Tylenol for headaches." I took his hand, squeezing it gently. "It's a mystery," I said quietly. "But she's going to be okay. That's what matters." He nodded, leaning his head against mine. "You're right. I'm just glad it wasn't worse." I closed my eyes, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne. My husband was distraught, unable to comprehend why anyone would do this. I sat quietly beside him, heart pounding in my chest, knowing that the truth would burn our marriage to the ground if it ever surfaced. That night, I couldn't sleep. David had finally drifted off around 3 a.m., exhausted from worry and confusion, but I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling. Our bedroom, usually a sanctuary, felt like a prison of secrets. Outside, the spring rain tapped against the windows in a gentle rhythm that should have been soothing, but only heightened my anxiety. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake David, and padded to the kitchen. The remnants of our anniversary, dinner still lingered. Half-empty wine glasses, plates with cake crumbs, the flowers Eleanor had brought now arranged in a vase on the counter. I picked up her wine glass, examining it in the dim light from the street lamps outside. It looked innocent enough, just a glass smudged with lipstick in the shade Eleanor always wore. Chanel's Rouge Allure in Pirate. A bold red, like a warning sign. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed what I already suspected. Traces of a mild sedative, something not fatal but certainly impairing, had been found in her system. The kind that, combined with alcohol, would make someone appear drunk, uninhibited, possibly even make them pass out. The kind that might make a dignified woman like Eleanor lose control at a family dinner, make a fool of herself in front of everyone, make her vulnerable. I shuddered, setting the glass down carefully. What had she intended? For me to slur my words? To stumble? To ruin the dinner I'd worked so hard to perfect? Or was there something more sinister planned? I recalled how she'd watched me with anticipation when she handed me the glass, how she'd kept her eyes on me as I pretended to sip the wine. I opened the cabinet beneath the sink and pulled out a trash bag. One by one, I collected the wine glasses, wrapped them in newspaper, and placed them at the bottom of the bag. The half-empty bottle of Cabernet followed. Then I tied the bag tightly and carried it outside to the large bin in our building's back alley, making sure it was buried beneath other garbage. Evidence gone. Back inside, I scrubbed the kitchen until it gleamed, as if I could wash away what had happened. By the time dawn broke over Boston, casting long shadows across our apartment, I had cleaned every trace of the dinner and rehearsed what I would say to David when he woke. The story was simple. His mother had experienced a bad reaction to something, perhaps an interaction between her medication and the wine. These things happen. No one's fault. But in the privacy of my thoughts, I reviewed the entire evening in my head like a movie reel. Her smirk, the deliberate way she poured the drink, the flicker of something dark in her expression. There was no doubt in my mind. She had intended to drug me, perhaps to embarrass me, or maybe worse. The realization turned my stomach. This wasn't just disdain anymore. This was premeditated sabotage. David woke around 7, immediately reaching for his phone to check for updates from his father. "Dad says she's doing better this morning," he said, voice still rough with sleep. "They're running a few more tests, but she'll probably be discharged this afternoon." I handed him a cup of coffee. "That's good news." He took a sip, then set the mug down on our bedside table. I keep thinking about what the doctor said. A sedative? It doesn't make any sense, Em. I sat beside him, choosing my words carefully. Maybe it was a mistake with her medication. Sometimes pharmacies mix things up. David shook his head. Mom checks her pills obsessively. Ever since Mrs. Peterson next door got the wrong prescription and ended up in the hospital. I nodded, remembering Eleanor's lecture on the importance of vigilance when it came to healthcare. The irony wasn't lost on me. Well, I said, at least she's okay. That's the important thing. He squeezed my hand. I'm sorry our anniversary dinner ended up like this. I forced a smile. We have plenty more to celebrate. We dressed and headed to the hospital. The spring day was bright and clear, a sharp contrast to the storm inside me. At Mount Auburn, we found Eleanor sitting up in bed, looking remarkably composed for someone who'd been unconscious less than 12 hours ago. Robert sat beside her, holding her hand. David, she said, smiling, weakly as we entered. Her eyes skimmed over me as if I were furniture. You didn't need to come back so early. Of course I did, my husband replied, kissing her cheek. How are you feeling? Much better, just tired. The doctor says I can go home after lunch. The conversation turned to logistics. Who would pick up her prescriptions? Whether she should stay with us for a few days. An idea I silently balked at. What she should eat. I stood by the window, half listening, watching a family in the parking lot load a new mother and baby into their car. Normal life continuing all around us. Emma. I turned at the sound of my name. Eleanor was looking directly at me for the first time since we'd arrived. Yes? Could you get me some water? The pitcher is empty, and Robert went to speak with the doctor. I nodded, taking the plastic pitcher from her bedside table. As I turned to leave, she added, and close the door on your way out. I'd like to speak with my son privately. The dismissal was familiar, but today it carried a new weight. I glanced at David, who gave me an apologetic smile. I'll just be a minute, he said. In the hallway, I stood by the water dispenser, filling the pitcher slowly. What was she telling him? Was she somehow spinning this to make me look guilty? I considered the possibility that she might remember, switching the glasses, might accuse me. But who would believe her? A woman found with sedatives in her system, claiming her daughter-in-law had drugged her at her own anniversary dinner. It would sound like paranoia. When I returned, David was alone in the room. Where's your mom? I asked, setting down the water. Bathroom, he replied, his expression unreadable. She asked me to wait here. I sat in the chair beside him. Everything okay? He nodded slowly. She wanted to tell me about some changes she's making to her will. Odd timing, but you know, Mom, practical even in a crisis. I relaxed slightly. Just typical Eleanor business then. When she returned, leaning on an IV pole, our conversation remained superficial. The weather, a documentary Robert had been watching, Sarah's new job. But beneath the pleasantries, I felt a current of tension. Eleanor's eyes kept finding mine when David wasn't looking, and there was something in them I couldn't quite read. Not anger, exactly. Something more calculating. We left around noon, promising to return later with some personal items for her overnight stay. In the car, David was quiet, preoccupied. Penny for your thoughts? I asked as we pulled into our parking space at home. He sighed, turning off the engine but making no move to get out. The next day, my husband informed me that his mother had requested to see only me. I hesitated, unsure whether to face her or continue pretending I knew nothing. But my curiosity and my need for closure won. I agreed to go alone while David went to work. The hospital corridor seemed longer than it had before as I made my way to Eleanor's room. A nurse stopped me, checking Eleanor's chart. "She's been asking for you," the nurse said with a smile. "Family is so important in recovery. If only she knew." I paused outside the door, gathering my courage. Then I knocked once and entered with steady steps, but inside, I was bracing for another storm. Eleanor was sitting up, her hair neatly combed, wearing a silk robe Sarah had brought from home instead of the hospital gown. Always maintaining appearances, even here. "Emma," she said, gesturing to the chair beside her bed. "Thank you for coming alone." I sat, placing my purse on the floor beside me. "How are you feeling?" "Better. Much better." She adjusted her position, slightly wincing. "The doctor says I can go home tomorrow morning." "That's good news." A silence stretched between us, taut as a wire. Outside the window, a bird landed on the sill, pecked twice, then flew away. "I suppose you're wondering why I asked to see you," Eleanor finally said. I met her gaze steadily. "I have some idea." She looked smaller in the hospital bed, stripped of her usual haughtiness. Her voice was soft, strained, yet every word was sharp. "I remember everything, you know. I remember pouring the wine. I remember you switching our glasses." My heart hammered in my chest, but I kept my expression neutral. "And I remember you watching me, waiting for me to drink from the glass you gave me, waiting for whatever you put in it to take effect." She didn't deny it. Instead, she smoothed the edge of her blanket, as if removing invisible wrinkles. "You've never been right for David. You must know that." "Because I didn't come from money? Because I work in publishing instead of law or medicine? Because I didn't go to the right schools?" "Because you took him away from his potential," she said, her voice rising slightly. "He was going to clerk for a Supreme Court justice, did you know that? Before he met you and decided to work for that nonprofit instead." I had known, of course. David had told me about the offer, about his decision to turn it down because he realized he wanted to make a different kind of impact on the world. It had been his choice, not mine. But Eleanor had never accepted that. Without naming the act directly, she insinuated that I had overreacted to harmless intentions, that I should have accepted her place in our marriage with grace, that what she did, whatever she admitted to, herself, was simply an act of protection for her son. "Protection?" I repeated, incredulous. "You put something in my drink, Eleanor. You were going to drug me at my own dinner table in front of my husband. How is that protection?" She waved a hand dismissively. "It was just something to help you relax. You're always so tense, so controlling. I thought if you loosened up a bit, maybe David would see." "See what? His wife impaired without her consent? How would that have helped anything?" She didn't answer directly. "You've never understood our family, Emma. The standards we hold ourselves to. The legacy we maintain." I said nothing for a long time. Then I told her what she never expected to hear, that I had seen through her game long ago, that I had tolerated her meddling, her subtle jabs, her controlling behavior, for the sake of peace. But that night had been a line crossed. She wasn't protecting anyone. She was trying to eliminate me, to undermine me in the most fundamental way. Her expression twisted with discomfort, but she didn't deny it. "What are you going to tell David?" The question hung in the air between us. We both knew how much David loved his mother, how devastated he would be to learn the truth. Before I left the room, I told her I wasn't going to tell her son what happened. Not yet. I wanted her to live with the weight of what she'd done, and with the knowledge that I had spared her, for now. Her silence was louder than any apology. The drive home from the hospital was quiet. Rain pattered against the windshield. As I navigated the familiar streets of Cambridge, each stoplight casting red and green glows across David's worried face. He had insisted on coming with me to pick up Eleanor, despite my suggestion that he could go to work. "She's been acting strange," he said, breaking the silence as we turned onto Brattle Street. "Dad says she hardly slept last night, just kept asking when you'd visit." I gripped the steering wheel tighter. Maybe she's still confused from the medication. "Maybe," David murmured, but he didn't sound convinced. Eleanor was waiting in a wheelchair by the entrance, Robert standing beside her with a small overnight bag. She looked remarkably put together, hairstyled, makeup applied, wearing a cream-colored pantsuit instead of the comfortable clothes Sarah had brought her. Always the picture of dignity, even after a hospital stay. David jumped out to help his father load her into the car. I watched through the rear-view mirror as Eleanor whispered something to him, her hand lingering on his arm. He nodded, then opened the back door for her. "Emma will take you home," he said. "Dad and I need to pick up your prescriptions." This wasn't what we'd planned. David was supposed to come with us to Eleanor's house, help get her settled. I turned to protest, but the look on his face stopped me. Whatever Eleanor had whispered had convinced him. "That's fine," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "We'll see you there." Robert gave me a grateful smile. "Thank you, Emma. We shouldn't be long." As they walked toward Robert's car, Eleanor settled into the passenger seat beside me. The scent of her Chanel perfume filled the small space, bringing with it memories of countless uncomfortable family dinners and tense holiday gatherings. I pulled away from the curb, hyper-aware of her presence. For several blocks, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the soft jazz playing on the radio, a station Eleanor had always complained about when David played it. "You can turn that off," she said finally. I reached over and pressed the power button. Silence descended, heavy and oppressive. "You didn't tell him," she said as we stopped at a red light. It wasn't a question. "No," I confirmed. "I didn't." "Why not?" I considered the question carefully. The light turned green, and I accelerated smoothly. "Because it would hurt him, and because I don't need to." Eleanor shifted in her seat. "What does that mean?" "It means I don't need to destroy his relationship with his mother to win. I just need you to understand that things have changed." I glanced at her briefly before returning my attention to the road. The old dynamic, where you undermine me and I take it to keep the peace, that's over. A slight smile curved her lips. "Because you think you have something on me now." "I know I do." The words came out harder than I intended. "The hospital has confirmed there was a sedative in your system. A sedative you don't take. If I told David what happened, if I told him you tried to drug me and accidentally drugged yourself, who do you think he would believe?" Her silence was answer enough. I turned onto her street, lined with the grand old colonials that had intimidated me when I first visited. Eleanor and Robert's house stood at the end, white with black shutters, a perfectly manicured lawn, flower, beds already blooming with early spring tulips. I parked in the circular driveway and turned off the engine. Neither of us moved to get out. "I need to understand why," I said, turning to face her. "After 5 years, why do this now? Why cross this line?" Eleanor stared straight ahead, her profile sharp against the green backdrop of the garden. "You wouldn't understand." "Try me," she sighed, a sound so weary it momentarily made me forget my anger. David was talking about children, about starting a family. The revelation caught me off guard. David and I had discussed having kids, but Only in abstract terms, something for the future. He told you that? Last month, when you were visiting your parents. He came for dinner and mentioned you two were thinking about it. She turned to look at me, her gaze piercing. I couldn't bear the thought of watching you raise his children, of seeing him pulled further away from his family, his responsibilities, his potential. The cruelty of her words stung, but beneath it, I sensed fear. Fear of losing her son completely. Fear of becoming irrelevant. So you thought if I embarrassed myself at dinner, what? He'd suddenly see me differently? Leave me? I thought if he saw who you really are, without all that careful control you maintain, he might reconsider tying himself to you permanently through children. I almost laughed at the absurdity. Who I really am. Eleanor, you tried to drug me, to take away my agency, my dignity. And you think that makes me the villain in this story? For the first time, I saw something crack in her perfect facade. A flicker of shame crossed her features before she composed herself again. It was a mistake, she admitted. I was desperate. Desperate. Enough to risk my health? To commit a crime? I shook my head. What was in that wine, Eleanor? She looked down at her manicured hands. Just a sleeping pill, crushed up. Nothing dangerous. Nothing dangerous, I repeated incredulously. Except that it interacted with the alcohol and put you in the hospital. I didn't think about that, she said quietly. I just wanted you to look foolish, to slur your words, maybe fall asleep at the table. I thought David would be embarrassed, disappointed. The admission hung between us. Outside, a cardinal landed on a nearby branch, its red plumage bright against the green leaves. Such a normal, peaceful sight amidst this surreal conversation. You know what the strangest part is? I said after a moment. I spent 5 years trying to win your approval, trying to be good enough for your son, for your family. I actually thought that anniversary dinner might finally be the time you'd see me as worthy. Eleanor's mouth tightened. You were never going to be good enough. Not because of who you are, but because you took him from us, from the path we'd laid out. He chose his own path, I countered. And he chose me. You need to accept that, or you're going to lose him anyway. She turned away, staring out the window at her perfect house with its perfect garden. So what happens now? You hold this over my head forever? Use it to turn him against me if I step out of line? No, I said firmly. That's not who I am. But things are going to change. You're going to treat me with respect. Real respect, not the fake politeness you've been hiding behind. You're going to stop trying to manipulate David. And you're going to acknowledge that we are a family, whether you like it or not. And if I don't? She challenged, though her voice lacked its usual steel. Then I'll tell him everything. Not to punish you, but because he deserves to know the truth about the people he loves. I unlocked the doors. It's your choice. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the door handle. He'll never believe you. But we both knew that wasn't true. The hospital records, her own behavior, the evidence was there. And deep down, I think she knew David had already begun to see cracks in the perfect mother image she'd cultivated. I don't want to fight with you anymore, Eleanor, I said softly. I'm tired of it. I want us to find a way forward, for David's sake. And for those children we might have someday. Your grandchildren. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but perhaps a reluctant recognition. She opened the door and stepped out, standing straighter than someone who'd just left the hospital had any right to. Help me inside, she said, not looking at me. Please. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a truce. but as I walked around the car and offered my arm for support, I felt the first tentative step towards something different, something that might, with time and effort, resemble peace. When Eleanor returned from the hospital, the energy in our home changed. David had insisted she stay with us for a few days rather than go back to her empty house. Robert had a business trip to Chicago he couldn't postpone, and Sarah lived too far away in Somerville to check in regularly. I'd agreed, partly because refusing would have seemed callous, and partly because I wanted to see if our confrontation had made any difference. The guest bedroom became Eleanor's temporary domain. She spent most of the first day resting, emerging only for meals that I prepared and brought to her on a tray. David hovered anxiously, checking on her between work calls, bringing her books and magazines, adjusting her pillows. I kept my distance, giving them space, using work as an excuse to retreat to my home office. On the second day, I came into the kitchen to find Eleanor at the table, fully dressed in one of her elegant pantsuits, scrolling through her iPad. "Good morning," I said, surprised to see her up so early. "How are you feeling?" She looked up, her face composed into a neutral expression. "Better, thank you." No passive-aggressive comment about the quality of the guest bed. No subtle criticism of our apartment's morning noise. Just a simple acknowledgement. It was disorienting. I made coffee in silence, hyper-aware of her presence. When I offered her a cup, she accepted with a nod. No reminder that she preferred it stronger, or with a specific type of cream that we never seemed to have. "David's already left for work," I said, sitting across from her. "He had an early meeting." "Yes," he told me. She set down her iPad. "Emma, I've been thinking about our conversation." My pulse quickened. I hadn't mentioned our talk in the car to David, unsure whether Eleanor would deny it had happened at all. "What about it?" I asked cautiously. She smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her sleeve. "You were right. About some things." Coming from Eleanor, this was equivalent to a full confession and apology on her knees. I sipped my coffee, waiting. "I haven't been welcoming," she continued, choosing her words carefully. "I had certain expectations for David's life, and when he chose differently, I blamed you instead of accepting his decisions." "That's understandable," I said, surprising myself with the concession. "You want the best for him." "I do." Her eyes met mine briefly. "But I've come to realize that my vision of best might not be his." We sat in silence for a moment, the morning sunlight streaming through the kitchen window, casting patterns on the table between us. Outside, a garbage truck rumbled by, the ordinary sound grounding this extraordinary conversation. "I won't pretend we're going to become best friends," Eleanor said finally. "But I am willing to try. Harder." "That's all I've ever wanted," I replied honestly. "For us to find a way to be family without the constant tension." She nodded once, decisively, as if concluding a business negotiation. Then she picked up her iPad again, signaling the end of the conversation. It wasn't warm or affectionate, but it was a beginning. Over the next few weeks, as Eleanor recovered fully and returned to her own home, I noticed subtle changes. She no longer mocked me in passive ways, but neither did she offer warmth. We became two actors in a stage civility, moving carefully around one another. She would still call David directly instead of speaking to me when she needed something, would still reminisce about family events that had occurred before I was in the picture. But the cutting remarks, the deliberate exclusions, the undermining comments, those had stopped. At Sunday dinners, which we'd resumed at Robert and Eleanor's insistence, I found myself exhaling a little more freely, no longer braced for attack with each course. Eleanor would ask me direct questions about my work, and though her interest seemed performative, the effort itself marked a change. "Your mother seems different lately," I remarked to David one night as we drove home from one such dinner. More, I don't know, accepting. He glanced at me, streetlights illuminating his profile. I've noticed that too. Less critical of everything. He reached over and squeezed my hand. Whatever happened during her hospital stay must have given her some perspective. I nodded, looking out at the familiar streets of Cambridge sliding by. Maybe so. My silence wasn't weakness. It was power. I had learned something about myself in those days after the dinner incident. I had boundaries now, and I had the strength to protect them. The next time Eleanor tried to schedule a family event without consulting me, I pushed back politely but firmly. When she suggested David should attend a law school alumni function alone, since Emma wouldn't know anyone, I calmly stated that I would be happy to accompany my husband. With every quiet resistance, I reclaimed more of myself. And surprisingly, Eleanor seemed to respect me more for it, not less. Our interactions took on a different quality, like two nations with a history of conflict, cautiously establishing diplomatic relations. One rainy Tuesday in May, about 2 months after the anniversary dinner, my phone rang with Eleanor's number. This was unusual enough to make me stare at the screen in confusion before answering. Hello? Emma. Her voice sounded strained. I'm sorry to bother you at work. It's fine, I said, saving the manuscript I'd been editing. Is everything all right? A pause. Not exactly. Robert's car broke down, and I'm stranded at Dr. Lieberman's office. David isn't answering his phone. He mentioned something about a conference today. He's at a symposium in Providence, I confirmed. No cell phones allowed during presentations. Another pause. I see. Well, I'll call Sarah then, though I hate to ask her to drive all the way from Somerville in this weather. I found myself speaking before I'd fully thought it through. I can pick you up. I'm working from home today, and it's not a problem. Silence on the other end of the line. Then, are you sure? Of course. Text me the address. I can be there in 20 minutes. I hung up and stared at my phone, slightly bewildered by my own offer. But as I grabbed my keys and raincoat, I realized it wasn't about scoring points or proving my superiority. It was about choosing what kind of person I wanted to be, regardless of Eleanor's past behavior. The drive to the medical offices in Newton was slow in the heavy rain. I found Eleanor waiting under the covered entrance, looking smaller somehow without her usual armor of confidence. When she saw my car, she hurried over, sliding into the passenger seat with a grateful sigh. Thank you, she said, shaking water from her umbrella. The receptionist offered to call a taxi, but with this weather... It's no trouble, I said, pulling back into traffic. I needed a break from work anyway. We drove in surprisingly comfortable silence for several minutes, the rhythmic swish of windshield wipers filling the space between us. Eventually, Eleanor spoke. The doctor says my blood pressure is still elevated. He wants me to make some lifestyle changes. I glanced at her, noting the tension in her face. Nothing serious, I hope. He says if I don't address it now, it could become serious. She stared out at the rain-blurred landscape. Robert's been telling me to slow down for years. Take fewer committee positions, delegate more at the foundation. That sounds like good advice, I ventured. She sighed. Perhaps, but it's difficult to step back, to let go of control. The irony of Eleanor admitting this to me, of all people, wasn't lost on either of us. A small smile tugged at my lips. I can understand that. And for the first time, she looked directly at me with something like genuine curiosity. I suppose you can. You're quite controlled yourself, aren't you? It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. I considered it as I navigated through a particularly congested intersection. I've had to be, I said finally. Growing up the way I did, with a mother who was unpredictable, Control felt like safety. I hadn't meant to reveal something so personal, especially to Eleanor. But in the intimacy of the car, with rain drumming on the roof and traffic crawling around us, the words had simply emerged. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. I didn't know that about your mother. It's not something I talk about much. I shrugged, but it shaped me, made me value stability, predictability. And then you married into our family, Eleanor said with unexpected wryness, where appearance and control are practically religions. I laughed, surprised by her self-awareness. I guess I did. As we pulled into her driveway, the rain easing, to a gentle patter, Eleanor turned to me. Thank you again, Emma. Not just for the ride. I nodded, understanding what she couldn't quite say. You're welcome. Eventually, she began to retreat, perhaps out of shame, perhaps out of fear, or perhaps because she finally realized I wasn't someone she could manipulate anymore. I hadn't destroyed her, but I had changed the rules of the game. And in doing so, I'd changed something in myself as well. The next time David suggested we skip Sunday dinner to attend a friend's gallery opening, I surprised him by saying we should do both. Dinner first, then the gallery. Are you sure? He asked, clearly remembering years of my finding excuses to minimize time with his parents. I'm sure, I said. And I meant it. Not because Eleanor and I had become friends, but because I no longer feared her power over me, or her influence on David. I had claimed my place in the family, not by force or ultimatum, but by standing firmly in my own truth. The ground beneath us had shifted, revealing a new landscape, not perfect or completely safe, but navigable. It felt like the first step onto solid land after years at sea. Months passed, and our anniversary dinner became a distant, uncomfortable memory. Summer arrived in Boston with its thick heat and afternoon thunderstorms. David and I settled into a new rhythm, one that included regular family gatherings but also firm boundaries. I found myself speaking up more, not just with Eleanor, but in other areas of my life. Requesting a promotion at work that I'd long deserved, reconnecting with old friends I'd let drift away while trying to fit into the Harrington family mold. Honor. A warm Saturday in July, we hosted a barbecue in the small community garden behind our apartment building. Nothing fancy, just hamburgers, corn on the cob, and cold beer. But it was the first time we'd invited both my college friends and David's family to the same event. In the past, I'd kept these worlds separate, afraid of Eleanor's judgment of my less polished friends, afraid of revealing too much of myself. You sure about this? David asked as he set up the grill. Mom and Dad with Casey and Zoe? Your editor friends with my law school buddies? I handed him the plate of burger patties. Why not? We're not compartmentalized people. Why should our social life be? He grinned, pulling me in for a quick kiss. I like this new you. The truth was, I liked the new me too. There was a freedom in no longer seeking Eleanor's approval, in no longer trying to be the perfect daughter-in-law. I wore my favorite sundress, bright yellow with tiny blue flowers, nothing like the subdued neutrals I usually chose for family events, and didn't worry about whether it was sophisticated enough for Eleanor's taste. The party was in full swing when the Harringtons arrived. Robert brought an expensive bottle of wine, as usual, but Eleanor surprised me by carrying a homemade blueberry pie. It's your favorite, isn't it? She asked as she handed it to me. David mentioned once that your grandmother used to make it. The pie gesture caught me off guard. I couldn't remember ever telling David about my grandmother's pies, but he must have been paying attention to some casual mention and then shared it with his mother. It is, I confirmed. Thank you. That was thoughtful. Eleanor nodded, a hint of uncertainty in her expression. This new territory was unfamiliar to both of us. The afternoon unfolded better than I could have expected. My friend Casey, with her bright pink hair and loud laugh, hit it off with Robert over a shared interest in jazz. Sarah brought her new boyfriend, a kindergarten teacher with an infectious enthusiasm for everything. David's work colleagues mingled easily with my publishing friends, and Eleanor, to my continued surprise, made an effort to engage with everyone, asking questions and actually listening to the answers. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows, across the garden, I found myself sitting on a bench near the tomato plants, taking a moment alone. The day had been wonderful but exhausting in the way that hosting always is. The constant attention to everyone's needs, the mental tracking of conversations and connections. Mind if I join you? I looked up to see Eleanor standing there, a fay, glass of lemonade in hand. I nodded, and she settled beside me, smoothing her linen pants. It was a lovely party, she said, watching the remaining guests chatting in small groups. Different from what I'm used to, but nice. Thank you for coming, I replied, and for making an effort with my friends. She smiled slightly. Your friend Casey is quite something. She told me all about her research on urban beekeeping. Fascinating, actually. I laughed, imagining proper Eleanor discussing beehives with pink-haired, tattooed Casey. She's passionate about it. Passion is admirable, Eleanor said quietly, even when it leads people in unexpected directions. I glanced at her, wondering if she was thinking of David's career choice, his passion for nonprofit work over corporate law. Before I could respond, she continued. I've been doing a lot of thinking since what happened. About control. About letting go. She took a sip of her lemonade. It's not easy for me. It's not easy for anyone, I offered. She nodded. Robert says I've spent so many years managing everything, the house, the foundation, the children's lives, that I don't know how to stop. And he may be right. She turned to look at me directly. The doctor says stress is making my blood pressure worse, that I need to learn to let things be. Are you taking his advice? A rueful smile. Trying. I've stepped down from 3 committees, hired an assistant for the foundation work, started taking a meditation class, if you can believe it. I could hardly imagine Eleanor cross-legged on a yoga mat, trying to clear her mind. The image made me smile. How's that going? Terribly, she admitted with unexpected candor. My mind races the entire time, but I'm told that's normal for beginners. We sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching a robin hop across the garden path. In the distance, David laughed at something Sarah's boyfriend said, the sound carrying across the evening air. He's happy, Eleanor said softly. Happier than I've seen him in years. I followed her gaze to where David stood, his face animated, as he told some story, gesturing with his beer bottle. Yes, he is. You're good for him, she said, the words coming reluctantly but sincerely. I didn't want to see it, but you are. The admission hung between us, fragile but real. I didn't know what to say, so I simply nodded my acknowledgement. I won't pretend I've completely changed, Eleanor continued. I'm still going to have opinions about how things should be done. I'm still going to worry about him, about his future. But I'm trying to step back, to respect the life he's chosen, the partner he's chosen. That's all anyone can ask, I said. She stood, smoothing her pants again in that habitual gesture. Well, I should find Robert. It's getting late, and he has an early flight tomorrow. As she walked away, I realized something important had just happened. Not forgiveness exactly. Neither of us had explicitly referenced the wine incident, but a kind of truce, a mutual recognition of our roles in David's life, and a tentative agreement to coexist more peacefully within them. Later that night, As David and I cleaned up the remnants of the party, he bumped his hip against mine playfully. "So, what were you and Mom talking about?" Looked serious. I stacked the last of the plates in the dishwasher. "Just life. Change. The usual." He raised an eyebrow. "The usual? Since when do you and Mom have deep conversations?" "Since recently," I said, closing the dishwasher and starting it. "People can surprise you sometimes." He wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. "Including yourself? You've been different these past few months. More confident. More..." He searched for the word. "Present." I turned in his embrace to face him. "Is that a good thing?" "It's a great thing," he said, kissing me softly. "I always knew you were strong, but now it's like you finally know it too." That night, lying in bed beside David's sleeping form, I thought about the woman I had become since that fateful anniversary dinner. I'd entered my marriage believing that keeping peace meant keeping quiet, that love required smoothing over conflicts rather than confronting them. I'd allowed Eleanor's disapproval to shape how I moved through the world, always trying to be smaller, less noticeable, less threatening to her vision of what David's wife should be. I often wondered what would have happened had I drunk that wine. Whether I would have simply passed out or made a fool of myself in front of everyone, just as she had hoped. That silent exchange of glasses had changed everything. Not because I sought revenge, but because it forced her to face the truth of her actions. And it forced me to finally trust my instincts. The most unexpected outcome wasn't Eleanor's grudging respect or the new dynamic in our family. It was my own transformation. I'd become someone who stood her ground, who spoke her truth, who recognized manipulation for what it was and refused to play along. I'd become someone who could be both kind and firm, both forgiving and clear-eyed. In Navarre, the quiet darkness of our bedroom, I made a promise to myself to keep this newfound strength, to nurture it, to remember that boundaries aren't walls, but healthy demarcations of self. Eleanor had taught me that lesson, though certainly not in the way she'd intended. The following weekend, David and I drove to Vermont to visit my parents. As we wound through the green mountains, windows down to catch the summer breeze, he mentioned, casually, that he'd been thinking more about starting a family. "Do you think we're ready?" he asked, glancing at me before returning his eyes to the road. 6 months ago, I might have hesitated, thinking of Eleanor's inevitable interference. Her criticism of my parenting, her attempts to mold any grandchild in her image. But now, I considered the question on its own merits. "I think we are," I said, surprising myself with the certainty I felt. Not because everything's perfect, or because we have it all figured out, but because we know who we are now, individually and together. He reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. That's exactly what I was thinking. As the road curved ahead of us, revealing a valley spread out below in shades of green and gold, I felt a sense of peace that had nothing to do with Eleanor or her approval. I had become someone stronger, someone who stopped playing polite when dignity was on the line. I didn't need to expose her to the world. Letting her live with the truth was punishment enough. And for me, the reward was something better than justice. It was peace. When we announced my pregnancy at Thanksgiving dinner 4 months later, Eleanor's face showed a complex mix of emotions: joy, concern, perhaps a flash of old possessiveness. But when she raised her glass in a toast, her hand steady and her eyes clear, I knew we had both traveled a long way from that night of switched wine glasses and hidden intentions. "To new beginnings," she said, looking directly at me, "and to the family we are becoming." I raised my water glass in return, meeting her gaze without fear or resentment. "To family," I echoed. in all its complicated glory. And in that moment, with David's hand warm in mine and a new life growing inside me, I understood that the woman I had become wasn't defined by standing up to Eleanor. She was defined by standing up for herself, for her right to be authentic, to take up space, to be both strong and vulnerable. The kind of woman I hope my child would be proud to call mother.